Hi everybody, welcome back from spring break. This is for English 221 and this is for our class for Monday, the 21st. And I hope you had an opportunity to have some rest during spring break and also had the opportunity to begin the histories as we transition from the comedy section to the history section. And you can see in the notes below, I had indicated that we've got some due dates coming up. So today, if you're watching this video on the 21st, then you have journal number 3, which is Much Ado About Nothing, which would be due at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email. I know some of you have already sent that. Thank you very much. And I will be returning that to you, much like I've returned the other journals, with just some general commentary. And I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, but I'm hopeful that those journals will be of some use to you when you are putting together a formal paper. And your first formal paper on comedy will be due on the 30th of March, which is a Wednesday, at 11:59 p.m., also via PDF to Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. We talked a little bit about the construction of a paper, and I wanted to talk about quotation as well. So again, if you look at the notes below, I just have a couple of odd and end quotes that I can't recollect if we had discussed previously about Much Ado About Nothing. The idea of Act 1, Scene 1, line 63, that they're in a skirmish of wit, a merry war. And I know that I wrote this in response to some of your attendance questions, that the setting is so important that the men are returning from war, but they're entering into another different kind of war, another battle. And it's a battle of wits, certainly, between Benedict and Beatrice. Act 1, Scene 1, line 160, when Claudio is trying so hard to get Benedict's approval, and it does portray Claudio in a rather negative light, in that he is thinking more of his match with Hero as one of convenience rather than true compatibility. It's one of the reasons why we probably as audiences prefer Benedict and Beatrice over to Hero and Claudio. He talks about how he's impressed with her appearance and it's the right time, in that he has returned from war, so he's ready to settle down. And also, Hero doesn't have any direct heirs, which will be very important because ultimately that means that Claudio is going to be responsible or will be benefiting from the estate. Again, we talked about in Midsummer Night's Dream that wasn't necessarily an unusual way for relationship to occur, relationship through convenience, but Benedict and Beatrice certainly seem to be the more interesting of the couples, especially when we see how well matched they both are in terms of their personalities. The Reality of Love, Act 2, Scene 1, line 72, and both Midsummer Night's Dream and Much Ado About Nothing have talked about the realities associated with love, both the good and the bad. And talking about this idea of gender, which we were discussing in A Midsummer Night's Dream, you can also see that in Much Ado About Nothing when we've got a Beatrice, for instance, lamenting the fact in Act 4, Scene 3, line 303, oh, if only I were a man. And again, you might say there's a little bit of manipulation there as she bemoans the fact that she can't speak up for Hero's honor. Therefore, she's convincing Benedict to try to stand up for Hero's honor by basically confronting Claudio. Perhaps there is a little bit of manipulation there, but there also is a good amount of truth as well, that as a woman that she doesn't necessarily have the agency that a man would have. Notice that Beatrice is independent in the sense that she doesn't necessarily have a father figure over her in the way that Hero does. We know how important that is when we saw that in A Midsummer Night's Dream. I also wanted to point out the title, Much Ado About Nothing. And obviously, people are making a big fuss about nothing or something that's trivial. Nothing at the time would have also been pronounced like noting. And the idea of noting or seeing, what you see or you don't see, is a theme. But also, it was a term for female genitalia. And I think that considering the importance of female sexual purity in this play, that title works very nicely as well. And as we move forward, this happy ending, which I put with a question mark, much like I did with Midsummer Night's Dream. I don't know how happy it was for Demetrius and that he was manipulated. And I don't necessarily know how happy it is for Hero and Claudio, certainly because Hero has been humiliated and treated so terribly, but yet she's willing to accept Claudio with open arms. In some ways, it almost reminds me of Hermia in Midsummer Night's Dream. But we do have the idea of the unification of the couples, and that is what's supposed to represent our happy ending. And Don John, our villain, will be punished later. And I had indicated that we will be seeing similarities when we get to Othello. The distinction being that Othello will end tragically, unlike Much Ado About Nothing. So, transitioning over into a new genre, and this would be Shakespeare's history plays. They're thought to have been written after the comedies. Again, we're not necessarily sure of the exact dating of the plays themselves, but usually scholars indicate that the comedies were probably during the earlier part of Shakespeare's career, and that they don't necessarily have the depth and the sophistication of some of the later plays. And then usually that's followed by the history plays, and then the height of Shakespeare's career, the tragedies, and then finally the tragic comedies. So the history plays are based on English history, but they're loosely based on English history. So it's useful to know something about the English history, but also it can be somewhat problematic, because if you are looking for pure history, that's not the retelling we're going to be getting in the history plays, and that Shakespeare basically dramatized them to suit his literary purposes. At the time, history plays were chronicle plays. They all were connected to one another, and we can see that with Shakespeare's plays. And that said, they can also stand as independent units. We're beginning the first play in the series, and that happens to be Richard II. But the story continues with Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and Henry V. And if we had the time, we could continue to read the entire English history. Keep in mind that it has to be English history, not just history in general. The history plays gave an opportunity to celebrate things like patriotism. It was a wonderful time for the English to come together and to renew their sense of national unity. It was also a wonderful time to give political commentary. And if you'll remember, I had indicated at the beginning of the semester some of the dangers associated with making political commentary, that Shakespeare's time was rather open-ended when it came to sexuality and violence, but that politics could be very dangerous. And this was a very tricky political time, though I wonder if there's ever been a time that wasn't a tricky political time, because Queen Elizabeth was aging and she didn't have a direct heir. Again, if you'll remember, they talked about Queen Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen because she didn't have an heir and she never married. And lots of speculation as to why, but certainly I suppose that one of the reasons would be that she would have lost the control of the kingdom that she would have had if she had married. So ultimately, there were all kinds of questions about who would succeed Queen Elizabeth because she didn't have a direct heir and she was aging. And there was lots of jockeying and lots of vying that was going on. And again, rather than talk about that publicly, which could get Shakespeare into trouble, he could tell a story from England's past that had many similar parallels. And of course, he could use that as a kind of a smokescreen, if you will, by saying that he never really intended to talk about current politics, that was just something that perhaps an audience might extrapolate, but that his intent was to talk about British history of the past, which is how he was able to get away with a good amount of his political commentary. Expect a good amount of darkness and death. And in fact, when we think about the play Richard II, the first in the history plays, its title in its entirety is the tragedy of Richard II. So there are many elements that are associated with tragedy that are also associated with Richard II. Now, the history plays are known as being notoriously complex. Expect lots of characters. And one of the reasons why it's difficult to keep track of all of these characters is because they oftentimes go by multiple names. So sometimes they might be referred to by their surname, and sometimes they might be referred to by their first name, and sometimes they might be referred to by their royal title, and sometimes they might be referred to by their nickname. So it I suggest it's very useful to keep a chart of all of the characters so that you do not become confused. The good news about Richard II is that there are really only a handful of major characters, even though we've got lots of minor characters. Think of the minor characters almost like window dressing in some respects, in that they help to populate the political world. But the major characters would be Richard and Bolingbroke as we go through the play. And some of the ways that they're similar and different from one another. Expect lots of political intrigue with lots of shifting alliances, and things aren't not necessarily going to be clear as they are in most political worlds. I oftentimes tell students, if they're having difficulty understanding the action in Richard II, to try to substitute some of the names with perhaps our current politicians in Washington, or perhaps some politicians from the past. Perhaps it might seem a little bit clearer to you, and that just because someone says something publicly, that doesn't necessarily reflect their true impressions and feelings, and that there's a lot of basically vying for opportunity in these plays, and there's a lot of grandstanding in many of these speeches. Keep in mind the chain of being, where at the top of the chain of being would be God, in effect, and the highest entity in the chain of being in the human world would be the king or the queen. They would be considered to be God's mouthpiece, in effect. And that's going to be important with Richard II, because Richard II has the birthright to be king. Unfortunately, just because he has the birthright, that doesn't necessarily mean he has the capability to be king. He's a very poor ruler. And Bolingbroke, it would seem, at least from the beginning of the play, has a much better facility to be a ruler, but he's not the direct heir. So we see that tension between the two. And the play, again, is loosely based on English history, where there was a boy king, King Richard, and basically he was spoiled by his advisors, and eventually when he matured into adulthood, he was a terrible king. And again, we can see that in the play of Richard II. He basically abuses his power, and he puts his flatterers into positions of power. And eventually he's overthrown by Bolingbroke. So one thing I can say about Richard II, it has perhaps some of the most famous Shakespearean speeches, absolutely beautiful long speeches. Expect a lot of talking and very little action. Part of that is just because of the limitations on stage. It's not necessarily always easy to stage something like a battle. But again, one of the perhaps weaknesses of Richard is that he's not a man of action. He is a poet. He really isn't a politician, as you will see from these long-winded speeches that he gives. But I wanted to shift gears a little bit to your first paper. And again, we were talking about the idea that everybody has the option of rewriting that first paper. So once you submit in that paper, I will review it, not just for content, the way I've been doing with journals, but also for grammar and mechanics. And then I will put a letter grade on it as opposed to a checkmark grade and return that to you. And if you're content with the grade, then you're done with the paper. However, what I am offering all of you is the opportunity to rewrite your paper for a higher grade if you so like to do so, incorporating my comments into your revision, and if you need further direction, then certainly to contact me. You've got up until the ending of the semester to do that, but the sooner the better for everybody involved. And again, think about the paper as a 4 to 5 page analysis, approximately, because ultimately the paper should be as long as it needs to be for you to support your thesis, the position that can be disputed that you're taking about that particular text. But I'm anticipating 4 to 5 pages, double space, 1-inch margins, of talking about one of the elements within the dramas. And I gave some sample suggested topics, but certainly you're encouraged to create your own topic as well. I encourage all of you to run by me ideas and thoughts that you might have in terms of the paper. And in order to be able to support your position, because if you'll remember, my job is basically to be skeptical. So whatever it is that you say, I'm saying the opposite until you have enough evidence from the text to support your particular position. And you're doing that through paraphrase, which is basically stating or restating some of the language in the play in your own words, or you're doing that with quotation, which means that you are writing out exactly word for word what was indicated. And again, I'm hopeful that quotation is something that you would have talked about in previous English classes, but you can see that in the seventh section, the notes below, I wanted to give you some examples of quotation from Shakespeare. So, if you're just quoting a word or several words, you do not need to document, just like in the first example I've given you. Hamlet speaks of himself as a, quote, dull and muddy meddled rascal, unquote. A, quote, coward, unquote. A, quote, villain, unquote. And an, quote, ass, unquote. However, if you are quoting something that's longer, you should document. And usually the way we do that is with parentheses immediately following the quote. And usually that would indicate something like page number. But Shakespeare is going to be an easier exercise because the plays are divided, as you know, into act, scene, and line, which means that you can reference act and scene and line, much like I've given in the second example in that section about quotation. Hamlet imagines the world as, quote, an unweeded garden / that grows to seed, unquote. And then in parentheses, you can see I've got Act 1 with a period following, Scene 2 with a period following, 135 through 136. So you're using Roman numerals, and then you're moving to the Arabic numerals. And then at the ending, you close your quotation marks, or I'm sorry, you close your parentheses, and then you either continue with your sentence or your ending punctuation. In this particular instance, it was ending punctuation. Notice in this example, I had talked about a slash. A slash indicates a break in a line of poetry because, as you know, much of Shakespeare's writing is in poetry. And the way that you can tell is that these are usually staggered lines when they're written in poetry, as opposed to one end of the page to the other or one end of the column to the other. And then continuing on, Hamlet's conception of the world reveals itself early in the first soliloquy. So in this instance, we would put a colon to indicate that we are going to be quoting, quote, "'Tis an unweeded garden / that grows to seed," unquote. And then in the parentheses, Act 1, Scene 2, line 135 through 136, close your quotation or close your parentheses, and then your ending quote. So if you are introducing a quote with a complete sentence, or if you are introducing a list, then you end up using something like a colon before the quote. Now, if you've got a long quote, which would generally be over 3 lines long, then what you want to do is to be able to either block off that quote. And in terms of Shakespeare, chances are that quote is already written in a poetic form. So if it is written in poetry, then basically you can follow the format of where the poem's lines end. And you can see that with the example I give you. Hamlet begins his first soliloquy with the wish for self-destruction. And there's a colon. And you can see that here I've just quoted the way that it would appear in the column or on the piece of paper that are the screen that is showing that particular speech, which is in poetry. "Oh, that this too sallied flesh would melt, thaw and resolve itself into a dew. Oh, that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter." And notice that the end punctuation comes first, and then we follow with the parentheses that indicates act, scene, and line. So when you're using block quotes, your ending punctuation comes first. Notice there's also no quotation marks because when you're using block quotes, basically you're indicating to the reader that you are quoting. So it would be considered to be redundant to use quotation marks. You only need to use quotation marks when you are actually quoting within the text itself, within your text itself, so that you could clearly indicate to the reader where a quote begins and ends. Now, if you were to happen to leave out some of a quote because it's not relevant, not because it's going to change the meaning, there are a couple of ways you can do this. You can do this with an ellipsis, which is just 3 periods to indicate that a word or several words have been left out. If you're leaving out a couple of lines, let's say in poetry, what you can do is, much like the example I have with Hamlet reflects upon the temptation to destroy himself, as when he wonders, who would bear the whips and scorns of time? And notice that the next line, rather than just 3 dots, I've got dot, 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 dot to indicate that an entire line or lines have been omitted. When he himself might his quietest make with a bare bodkin. Ending our ending quote or our ending punctuation, and then in the parentheses, act, scene, line. And of course, you can think about if you were going to be leaving out a word or several words, such as in the example I gave you. World weariness overtakes Hamlet in his remarks to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Quote, I have of late, dot, 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 or ellipsis, but wherefore I know not, dot, 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 or ellipsis, lost all my mirth, forgone all custom of exercises. And indeed, it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, this earth, seems to me a sterile promontory. And again, we've got in our parentheses, act, scene, line, and then our closing punctuation. Generally speaking, you should only use that ellipsis when omitting something from the middle of a passage. You don't need to do it when you're omitting something from the beginning or the ending of the passage, because you get to determine where to begin and where to end your quote. In the last example that I gave you, Hamlet again chastises himself in the soliloquy following the player's speech. Quote, oh, what a peasant slave am I. And again, in parentheses, what we have is Act 2, Scene 2, line 550. So you can see that these are some small differences about how we would go about quoting from a Shakespearean drama, but the intent is the same, is that at the ending of the quote that you're giving the reader enough information so that they could verify the authenticity of that quote. And while we usually have to worry about things like page numbers and the additions of the text that we're using, because Shakespeare plays are divided into act, scene, and line, it doesn't really matter what edition we're using because that should be universal, which actually simplifies things. And usually you would add a works cited page where you would, at the ending of your paper, cite all of the text that you're quoting from. And certainly that would be necessary if you were writing a research paper. As I was indicating with this first and your second paper that we'll be due at the ending of the semester, these are critical papers. In other words, I'm not expecting you to do outside research, but if you are intent on doing research, come talk with me, because there's certainly some room for negotiation. I believe in flexibility. But part of my intent in this class is to make sure that you have enough facility with the language that you could read a Shakespearean play on your own. You don't necessarily need to rely on scholars or outside interpretation once the course is over. So I wanted to give you practice in being able to do that with, in this instance, it would be the comedies, though the sonnets are a possibility for a paper, but just understand that the sonnets are a very different kind of animal. So you would probably have to approach it in a different kind of way. So that said, the idea of the critical paper, the assumption is if you are in your parenthetical documentation indicating act, scene, and line, then you wouldn't necessarily need to have a works cited page, assuming that, again, you have familiarity with writing a works cited page. So what I'm trying to say is that I don't necessarily require a works cited page. That said, if you do submit in a works cited page, then you want to make sure that you are following all of the guidelines of the MLA and how to indicate that particular text. Keep in mind that the GCC library has some links on how to go about doing that. Purdue OWL is a wonderful website as well that talks a little bit about how to go through and document. And you can always ask me as well if you weren't necessarily sure. But I'm assuming you've already done this and you already have some familiarity and comfort with it. So as far as I'm concerned, as long as you are in parenthetical documentation indicating act, scene, and line, you don't necessarily have to include a works cited page. But again, if you do include a works cited page, do make sure that you are doing it correctly. Just follow the MLA guidelines, which you can look up easily enough online, but also consult with me. So, in terms of today's attendance question, I thought this would put closure onto our comedy section. Since we've read 2 comedies, I'm going to ask you, which of the 2, A Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing, did you prefer, and why? Again, the kind of question for which there is no right or wrong answer. I'm just sort of interested in your thinking. This might perhaps also help you with determining which play you are going to be writing your first paper about. So that attendance question will be due on the 23rd of March, which is a Wednesday at 8 o'clock in the morning. Again, if you need additional time, feel free to ask me. And then what we will do next class is transition over into Richard II. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class with History Plays. Take care. Bye-bye.